Hello, everybody. And today I'm very excited to be bringing something to you that I thought I would never get around to doing, which is an analysis of the novel Penpal by Dathan Auerbach. Dathan, I believe. Could be Dathan. I'm not sure. I'm going to assume it's Dathan, though. Anyways, a lot of people might not know this about me. Well, unless you know me personally, and then you definitely know this about me. But I was a creepypasta kid growing up, whatever that means. So I was really into all of this lore around characters like Slender Man. And at some point, I had read just about every one of the big creepy pastas, the good ones, your No End House, your Psychosis, your Gateway to the Mind, all of these ones that are considered generally a bit above the average. But one that eluded me, or rather I eluded it, was Pen Pal. So I've long known that this is supposed to be one of the best internet horror stories ever written, but for some reason I never got around to reading it. Maybe it's because I thought it was too long or something back in the day, but I never ended up reading this story. And it's only with releases of relatively recent media, such as the Creepcast reading of this story, and also Davis Morgan's video on Pen Pal, I think about 6 months ago at the time of this recording, that I really became interested in seeking this story out. Now, of course, as you can tell from the fact that I'm holding this in my hand, Pen Pal was actually published as a physical novel. I actually got this at a used bookstore near my house. Just on a whim, I was checking out the horror section, and I didn't expect to find a copy of Pen Pal, but find it I did. So today I'm going to be talking about Pen Pal. I'm going to be doing a summary of the events of the story and giving some of my thoughts along the way, and then I'm going to go into a more detailed analysis. I've seen a lot of people talk about this book in regards to its plot, trying to figure out things about the antagonist, the stalker figure in this book, and try to get a hold of his motivations or see if there are any clues as to the identity of this character. That's not really what I'm interested in here. A lot of people have covered the mystery elements of this story. What I'm more interested in is a thematic analysis of this story. I'll say at the very beginning here that this is one of the most potent horror stories I've ever read, and that seems a bit hyperbolic considering that it was originally a creepypasta, an internet horror story, but it's absolutely true. In terms of true horror, in terms of a building up of dread throughout the chapters, I think this is one of the best horror stories I've ever read. It's not perfect, but it's so effective, and a lot of professional writers could learn from this book as well. Even more so, this book has something to say about the human condition. It has things to say about causality, about time, about feelings of regret. In many ways, it is a deeply psychological book. And I think this doesn't get talked about very often. This often gets swept under the rug so that we can talk about the horrifying elements of it. But there's a philosophy in here that I'd like to discuss. So, one thing that I'll start with here is by mentioning that, yes, this is the novel version of Pen Pal, and therefore it has differences from the original story that you can find online. But the differences are relatively minor. There are only a couple of times where there are significant differences. And to start at the very beginning, one of them is the use of a prologue at the beginning of the novel version. So let's get into the meat of things. Our first chapter, Memories, begins with the narrator talking about the concept of memories. He discusses a time when he was working at a deli, and he remembers an occurrence when he made a young girl's day by giving her 5 different flavors of ice cream, as the girl was suffering from some kind of analysis paralysis trying to choose a flavor. There's a line here that I love so much, and I don't think it's super relevant to the rest of the plot, but I'm really glad that it's in here just because it's beautiful language. The narrator says, "As I watched her try to pick just one flavor, I could see how anxious she was becoming. It wasn't greed that beset her. It was the result of wanting many things equally, but not having the emotional resources to settle arbitrarily on just one. Although no scenario like this exactly happens in our story, the theme of indecision is somewhat important throughout this narrative. Our narrator, and especially his mother, find themselves caught in indecision at times. Usually, the choice is binary in this story between telling the truth and concealing it, between comforting lies and harsh reality. One of our narrator's primary regrets in this story will also relate to a moment of indecision regarding his best friend Josh, but we'll return to the prologue for now. Our narrator notes that, while this might have been the happiest day of the girl's life up to that point, she likely doesn't remember it at all. The years will have stripped the joyous moment, ultimately of little consequence, from her memory. He continues, truth to tell, at any point in our lives, we've forgotten more than we know about our own history. The world moves on, and so do we, and what was once important fades away. He continues his reflection by contemplating how people can unconsciously alter their own history by forgetting. We want so badly to be happy, to live the kinds of lives that we always hoped we'd live, that we give gifts to ourselves by remembering things not as they were, but as we wish they were. Our narrator continues by saying that he now remembers, having followed the threads of memories to reconstruct those memories that once were. What follows is an account of his life, an autobiography of sorts, collecting the memories in the order that he remembers them. Our first chapter proper, Footsteps, details the narrator's early life as a low income child in a rural neighborhood. Living in a prefabricated home in the country, our narrator nonetheless enjoyed the simple pleasures of life, never feeling as if he didn't have enough. His single mother worked tirelessly to provide for him. He talks about his time adventuring in the woods and how he made a game out of returning before sundown, creating fears for himself of strange monsters in the woods, or the greater fear that not arriving on time would cause his mother and home to disappear. He recalls some strange times when he would go to sleep on the top bunk of his bunk bed, only to awake on the bottom bunk. This common enough childhood experience is altered one night when he awakes not in the bottom bunk, but outside the bed, and outside his house entirely. Nearly woken by footsteps entering his room, but not roused by them, our narrator awakes to find himself outside of his house. He says, I saw, or rather my mind showed me, the red cylindrical bars that supported the mattress of the top bunk. But beyond those, I saw stars. Gradually, the bars melted away and faded from my vision, and I was left with only those floating points of light and the jagged, crossing limbs of the tall trees that arced across them high up in the sky. I shouldn't be here, I thought. Our narrator at this point in the story is about 6 or 7 years old, if I recall correctly. Our narrator walks for what seems like hours through thorny terrain, cutting his feet on thorns. We find our narrator is quite bright for his young age, as he decides to climb a tree to get a better view of his surroundings. However, he continues to wander instead. He flashes back momentarily to a question he remembers from his past. How far can you go into the woods? He remembers his grandfather solving this riddle by saying, about halfway. A warm memory that somewhat invigorates our young narrator as he shivers in the cold. A positive example of a buried memory compared to the negative examples that we'll see here. We'll also see that this phrase, how far can you go into the woods, is a repeated motif throughout this story, usually harboring bad memories, but in this case, it's a positive one. Our narrator finds himself back where he started, noting the presence of a shark pool float, which he saw earlier. The narrator once again shows great cleverness for his age by orienting himself by what he believes to be the North Star and trying to follow it. Eventually, he finds his way to the ditch, a deep hole in the ground that he and his friend are used to playing by. Our narrator makes it back home, where he sees a strange man inside the house, and suddenly he's grabbed from behind. He struggles to break free, shouting for his mother, before realizing that the person grabbing him is his own mother, and the strange man is a police officer come to investigate. He is then informed by his mom that they thought he was gone for good. They found a letter on his bed announcing that he had run away. As the narrator examines the note, even his 6-year-old mind realizes something is wrong. His name is spelled wrong on the letter. The following chapter, Balloons, establishes how our narrator came to be the subject of unwanted attention and where the title Penpal comes from. A school project involves sending a message tied to a balloon into the air. Members of the community will find the balloons and write letters to the child by sending them to the school, and a correspondence between the student and their new pen pal is meant to ensue. Of course, this is kind of a ridiculous idea, and I don't know how any school board would ever approve this kind of action, but nonetheless, this is the premise of our story. The narrator works hard on a letter and even includes a dollar bill for postage. But another child spills some water on his letter, ruining some of the writing, including our narrator's signature. Nonetheless, all the balloons are released, and the students soon begin receiving responses. When the narrator finally receives his, he's perplexed and disappointed. Instead of a letter, he receives a blurry Polaroid. There was no letter. The only thing in the envelope was a Polaroid, but I couldn't make out what the image was. It looked like a patch of desert, but it was too blurry to decipher. It appeared as if the camera had been moved while the picture was being taken. It was just a Polaroid and nothing more. It didn't even have a return address. Over the semester, the narrator receives nearly 50 Polaroids in this manner, but he doesn't take the time to examine them at all, and neither does, apparently, his teacher. Snow cones to people. We are introduced also to the kindly old neighbor, Mrs. Maggie, at this time. Our narrator and Josh end up receiving an interesting note as a form of payment on one day, the same dollar bill that our narrator had attached to his balloon. The boys think of it as just a cool coincidence, but we as the audience know that more is at stake. The narrator brings Josh to his house to look at his Polaroid collection, thinking that it's just a cool thing to show his friend, and he finally takes a good look at the pictures. I was in every photo. None of them were close shots. None of them were only of me, but I was in every single one of them. Off to the side, in the back of a group, at the bottom of the frame. Some of the pictures had only the tiniest part of my face captured at the very edge of the photo, but nevertheless, I was there. I was always there. At this point, we might be wondering if the person who is sending these Polaroids is intentionally keeping our narrator out of focus in the pictures, or if he's just really, really incompetent. Anyways, the narrator's mom goes through the mail and receives yet another Polaroid, a picture of Josh and the narrator taken from the woods. The narrator's mom calls the cops immediately, confusing her son. It soon becomes apparent why she is doing this. The envelope has no postmark. It was delivered by hand. Chapter 3, Boxes, introduces the narrator's cat of the same name. Having horribly broken his arm at the age of 4, our narrator receives a kitten from his mother, soon to become a companion and, for a time, his only friend. Boxes frequently escapes outside of the house, but the narrator's mother finds a way to lure him back using the sound of an electric can opener. The narrator recounts that the final day Boxes escapes underneath the house was also the last day at their old home before they moved unceremoniously. Boxes hides under the house, and the narrator's mother, having already packed up the can opener, needs to go under the house herself to get him back. When she returns, she has made up her mind to leave the house immediately, even though the move is only supposed to be finished at the end of the following week. Skipping ahead a few years to the 2nd grade, our narrator receives walkie-talkies as a gift. These allow himself and Josh to communicate across long distances, which is necessary for them since he's moved house. Our story then skips forward again to the 5th grade, where our protagonists are 10 years old. Boxes goes missing, not returning to the house for several weeks. The narrator gets the idea that Boxes may have returned to the old house, not the current one. This idea strikes me as a little bit odd, but not impossible, I suppose. The narrator and Josh go out to look for Boxes, passing through the woods and the exact spot where the narrator found himself in our first chapter. even finding the same shark pool float from before. The narrator is haunted once again by that question: how far can you go into the woods? A reminder of the time that he found himself seemingly teleported to the center of the woods. The two boys make their way to the old house at night, discovering that rather than being housed by a new family, it has simply been completely abandoned. No one is living there anymore. Our narrator ends up going into the house to search for boxes, while Josh goes inside. As he descends into the crawl space, he remarks that it smells like death in there. He fears for the worst as he feels fur as he's moving around in the darkness. I staggered back in horror and disgust. Jesus Christ! Escaped my trembling mouth. It was a hideous and twisted creature, badly decomposed. Its skin had rotted away on its face, so the teeth were revealed in an ever present sneer that made them look enormous. Its eyes had either sunk back into its skull or were simply gone altogether, but I still felt like it was looking right at me. The smell radiating from it was unbearable. The narrator is relieved, in a way, to realize that he is seeing a raccoon. Underneath the house, he discovers a blanket and several bowls of cat food. Being still a child, he misinterprets the evidence as a sign of his mother's work. He does not remember the events that transpired on the day he moved, discussed in the previous chapter. Our character's inability to link these seemingly isolated incidents is a source of constant tension throughout the story. Our narrator discovers many, many bodies of animals underneath the house, perhaps even dozens of them. As he's thinking about his mother's supposed actions of putting cat food and a blanket underneath the house, his thoughts are interrupted by Josh, who shares some dreadful information. He says, "I found your clothes." "Oh, cool. Where were the boxes?" "Like I said, there are no boxes. Your clothes are in your closet. They're hanging up." "That can't be right, Josh. They're supposed to be in boxes." "I put them in boxes. Stop messing around and come back outside." "No joke, man. I'm looking at them. Maybe you thought that you left them all packed up." "Ha ha. Wow. Talk about an ego." "What? What do you mean?" "Your walls, man. Your walls are covered in Polaroids of yourself. They're like hundreds of them. What, did you hire someone to—" Josh is interrupted and barely escapes a run in with who we now know is the stalker, making his first verified appearance in the story. He takes a picture of Josh, but allows him to flee. Josh and the narrator make a hasty retreat to Josh's house, but there's evidence to suggest that they were tailed all the way back to Josh's house, with the stalker now knowing where Josh lives. The chapter ends with our narrator hearing boxes meowing below the covers on his bed. Only it isn't boxes, at least not directly. It's the walkie-talkie. Josh's had been left in the old house, and boxes is never coming back home. Chapter 4, Maps, begins with a description of the narrator's hometown. The town is imagined as being mapped onto the tentacles of some dead giant squid, a series of wavy paths leading to one central road. Our narrator's focus settles on the old colonial house of one Mrs. Maggie. Mrs. Maggie is a friendly woman who suffers from dementia, mistaking the main character and Josh for her own sons, who are actually long since grown up. Maggie is recovering from the tragic death of her husband Tom, a pilot who died after pushing himself too hard during a run. Tom died preparing himself for a trip to Rome with Maggie, a trip which he would never take. Maggie is under the impression that her husband will one day come back, having forgotten that she was already informed of his death. The boys spend a lot of time playing in the lake near Mrs. Maggie's house. The narrator's mother only forbids him from entering the house, a precaution to keep him safe from being supervised by an old and mentally unwell woman, and reasonable enough. This is also where we learn where the shark float supposedly comes from, as Maggie gifts it to the boys in this chapter. However, this is one of the novel version's least sensible changes from the original. The characters never make mention of having recognized the pool float earlier in the story, so it makes it incomprehensible that our narrator never recalls it as such in earlier chapters. He just remarks on it being a shark pool float. We move on to Josh and the narrator's ambitious project, one too ambitious and convoluted for the age of 5 years old, it must be said. They plan to map the entire region, finding a way through the woods that connects their two houses. They begin surveying and staking land on the side of the lake. Impeded by the lake cutting through the forest, the boys decide to construct a raft, a feat which should be impossible for their age, but one which they complete with relative ease. Josh and the narrator end up losing the pool float and a towel. It is obvious to us that someone has taken them, but the boys don't understand this. Fast forward a little bit, and a woman named Samantha, one of the narrator's mother's co workers, comes over one day. They plan to bring the narrator with them to work, but an act of sabotage stops them. Someone has stabbed a nail into the tire of his mother's car. His mother leaves without him in Samantha's car, promising to call every half hour. There's just one problem: the phone line is disconnected due to late payments. As such, our narrator and Josh take the opportunity to go out, not realizing the air of danger and malevolence about the whole situation. Going back into the woods, it's not long until the boys hear the sounds of something moving through the woods, snapping branches as it goes. Rapidly and rhythmically, we heard the woods speak out. Crunch, snap, crunch. It seemed to be moving slightly away from us, pushing through the woods just beyond our map. It had become too dark to see. We had misjudged how long the sun would linger. Nervously, I called out, "Hello?" "Hello, Mr. Monster in the Woods. I know you're sneaking around, but maybe you'll answer to my hello, hello." I realized how stupid it was. Whatever animal it was, it wouldn't respond. I hadn't even realized I'd said it until afterwards, but if anything was actually there, I obviously wouldn't get a reply. Josh continued, "Hello," in a high falsetto. "Hello," I countered with a deep baritone as I could manage. "Hello there, mate. Hello, beep boop." "Hello." We continued mocking each other and were in the process of turning the raft around to head back when we heard, "Hello." It was a breathy and airy whisper, the kind you might hear as someone read to himself, broadcasting his voice, but not realizing it. The boys flee on the raft and eventually into the woods, attempting to get a sight of their pursuer. They seem to lose him, but are surprised to run into Mrs. Maggie, who tells the narrator gravely that someone is home. Self centered and simple minded as his 5-year-old self is, the narrator assumes that she is informing him that his mom's home. Looking back on the situation, he realizes that what she really said was Tom's home. Only Tom wasn't home at all. A few weeks later, the police discover Mrs. Maggie's body, butchered and placed into garbage bags. Whoever she saw that night didn't like Mrs. Maggie being near the narrator. Chapter 5, Screens, briefly flashes back to the past to talk about the narrator's friendship of convenience with a boy named Alex. But it really exists to set up the relationship between our protagonist and his friends, Chris, Adam, and Ryan, and their reasons for being friends with each other. The boys, now teenagers, like to go to the movie theater together, and it is there that our narrator meets Veronica. Veronica, only briefly mentioned previously in the text, is Josh's older sister. He hits it off with Veronica, and they decide to meet again to watch George Romero's Day of the Dead together. They have a great time at the movies, and it's clear that the two of them have great chemistry. Then, this absolute idiot of a man decides that he needs to go take a leak behind the theater before they head on home, and it is here that the horror begins anew. You see, our narrator has been tailed on the way to the theater by a car who conveniently assumes to be a theater worker. Now, as he is separated from Veronica, he hears the revving of an engine, followed by a horrible screech. He returns to find Veronica on the ground, twisted and crumpled on the black asphalt of the parking lot, her limbs so unnaturally contorted that she looked like a child's discarded wooden art doll that now showcased a catalog of things the human body cannot do. An ambulance comes to take Veronica away, and our protagonist rides there with her. Veronica is only able to say one thing to our main character: that her attacker took a photo of her. It is on this night that Veronica reveals, horribly wounded from the hospital bed, something shocking to the narrator. Josh is missing, having supposedly run away at the age of 13. Even with his memories being dim of his earlier life, our narrator still remembers the time he woke up in the middle of the woods. He remembers his own supposed running away note. He knows that something is wrong. Our narrator ends up corresponding through text with the injured Veronica, while he stays away from the hospital due to her wish to not be seen. The narrator's relationship with his mother becomes strained and distant. It's obvious that she knows something that she won't let on. Veronica responds only briefly to the text messages sent to her, but sends a message to the narrator affirming her love for him, and he responds in kind. Eventually, she sends him another message: "See you tonight." Our narrator goes to the theater to see Acura, waiting for Veronica to show. Instead, all he gets is an inconsiderate man sitting in the chair next to him, eyes looking forward at the screen. Our narrator recounts that the man was breathing in an odd way, which seemed to unnerve him somewhat, but he ultimately decides that it doesn't matter who he has to sit next to, since Veronica isn't there. The next day, our narrator receives a message from Veronica: "See you again, soon." So, of course, Veronica isn't showing up, and yet she seems to be acting as if she has. Things are getting very confusing and frustrating for our narrator at this point. Thankfully for him, he soon runs into Veronica's mom and tries to get an explanation from her about Veronica's distant manner. It is then that he learns another horrible truth: Veronica has been dead for weeks. This revelation is well delivered, even if it's really nonsensical. After all, why was a friend of Veronica, Josh, and their family in general not invited to her funeral? Why was he left completely out of the loop these past few weeks? No idea. Regardless, we learned that the text messages were most assuredly not coming from Veronica, and that the thief of Veronica's phone has actually been sending hundreds of photos using her phone, which doesn't come through on the narrator's outdated cell phone, which can't receive images. We will never learn what these images are, but we can make some horrifying guesses. Moving on to the final chapter, Friends. It relates how our narrator finally came to piece everything together. We start with him talking about a time he nearly ruined his arm cast by getting it wet. At the age of 5, I believe, he had broken his arm before the first day of kindergarten. So I guess he could have been 5 or even 4 at the time. Frantically attempting to dry it, he begins to destroy the cast, smelling rot as he does. His mother dries the cast and covers up the stench with soap, perhaps a clever metaphor for what his mother has been doing with his past. Our narrator goes to school for the first time with his arm cast and meets his friend Josh, bonding over a Ninja Turtles lunchbox. Josh is also the first person to sign his arm cast. Josh becomes his first friend, and by the narrator's admission, his only real friend. He recounts how he and Josh became inseparable. Even after he moved across town, their friendship had remained strong. He thinks back to that night when they went to find boxes. That was the moment it all went downhill. But why? As readers, we now have a good idea, but he doesn't see it quite yet. Then comes the time of our narrator's 12th birthday. To his surprise, Josh actually comes. He berates Josh for blaming him about the incident with boxes, but Josh barely responds. Our narrator receives as one of his gifts an unmarked envelope. Inside it is a card with just a few words written on it: "I love you." The same message our narrator will receive by text 3 years later. The narrator talks to Josh again, with the two boys trying to reconcile. Josh promises to call more often. As Josh goes to leave, the narrator considers hugging him, but ultimately decides against it. As Josh leaves, he admits something to the narrator. "I think I've been sleepwalking," he says. These words confirm our greatest fear as readers. Ever since that day that Josh was caught in the narrator's house, he has become an object of fascination for the same stalker. It will not surprise us then that the same stalker has been responsible for all the negative events described in the book. We hurry onward now towards the climax. Our narrator pushes his mother to reveal the truth as we go back to the present day. As he does, he can feel their relationship being strained to the breaking point. He knows that this relationship will never be the same. Nonetheless, his mother describes what actually happened. It's Josh's father that discovers the body. He's working hard at a construction job, trying to level a stubborn patch of earth, when he comes across a wooden crate. a casket of sorts that's impeding his work. What he finds inside understandably crushes him. He calls the narrator's mother frantically, and she comes to see the grisly scene. Josh, wearing clothes that are too small for him, his hair painted black to match that of the narrator, and a large naked man stuck together in a parody of a loving embrace. Josh was dead. His face was sunken in and contorted in such a way that it was as if all the misery and hopelessness of the world had been transferred to it. As the narrator's mother examines the scene, she sees a picture on the shirt Josh is wearing, a picture of her own son as a child. Josh's father decides to destroy the scene and burn the body, at least of his child's murderer. He promises to give Josh a different final resting place. In any event, both Josh's father and the narrator's mother agree to never tell anyone what really happened. Our story ends with the narrator thinking of what might have happened had things been only slightly different. He apologizes for having ever met Josh, but promises to cherish their memories. To begin my analysis of this story, I would like to talk about the unique narrative structure that is used here. As you've been following me, you will have realized that this story is told in a non chronological order. We begin kind of in the middle of things, and chapters go back and forth between past, present, and somewhat more recent past as well. Having just recently read The Great God Pan, I was reminded of that story when looking at the structure of Penpal. Non chronological order, introducing elements at the time of maximum possible impact. Consider the I love you revelation that occurs in the final chapter when our narrator receives that mysterious card with the words written upon it. By the time he receives this card, we as the audience know that it is the calling card of the stalker. We have seen it used in his text messages to the narrator earlier in the narrative, but later in chronological time. If these elements were placed in chronological order, they would be much less effective. They would spoil the monstrous surprise, for example, that Veronica's phone had been stolen by the killer. For at least a little while, we can believe that Veronica is actually texting the protagonist, however out of place it seems for this story. Through recontextualization, we see now that the stalking has never stopped. Even at the age of 12, we know that the stalker was able to find his way to the narrator's party and drop off that envelope. He may have never been able to talk to our narrator or to take him, but he's always watching, even in those seemingly peaceful years. Each chapter is set up brilliantly. Usually, it begins with a lot of talking about the narrator's past life, seemingly unrelated to the horror story that's unfolding before us, but always it has some relevance to what we will see later in the chapter. For example, the chapter Screens begins with describing the ostracization the narrator felt after having suffered from pink eye. But what it really does is introduce us to the character of Veronica, which is key for the next chapter. Boxes also starts with events in the past, going back to before kindergarten, before moving forward into the yet unseen time of the fifth grade. What is happening here is the narrator, or perhaps the author, is organizing things in such a way to show that they are all related through memory. Memories are not strictly chronological. Memories work through the association of one thing with another and ultimately create a complex web that attaches experiences across time. This would explain why not only do our chapters differ in the order that they occur, but also within chapters, we have this moving throughout the different times of the narrator's life. It is like this in the final chapter, Friends, as well, which incorporates scenes from the narrator's time in kindergarten, his 12th birthday, the time after Veronica's death, in his 15th year, all of these together. The title headings usually inform us of what theme each chapter will have: screens, boxes, friends. This word links the events together throughout time. As might be expected, the themes of causality and regret are talked about a lot in this story. The narrator makes some great observations about the nature of time and how things relate to one another. For example, in boxes, as the narrator approaches his old home and sees his old climbing tree, he remarks, I realized I wouldn't be back here this night if that tree hadn't grown, and I was briefly in awe of how all events are like that. All events are sequential based on other things that happened in the past, seemingly unrelated things. If that tree hadn't grown, our narrator wouldn't have climbed it. If our narrator hadn't climbed it, he wouldn't have broken his arm, and then he probably wouldn't have received his pet cat. Ergo, he wouldn't be looking for his pet cat and going back to his abandoned house. Even his first meeting with Josh would have been very different if the narrator hadn't broken his arm climbing that tree. Perhaps we could have ended up with no boxes and no Josh. The unintended consequences of actions which cannot be perceived at first always reverberate throughout time. Close to the end of the final chapter, Friends, this topic crops up again. Our narrator thinks, I think about what our lives might be like now if I had just let my balloon go with Chris, or even a single second sooner or later than I did. Maybe someone else would have found it, and everyone would be okay. Maybe I'd still have my friend, and his parents would still have a son. Well, there's something profound in these revelations that even the smallest actions have consequences in a way we cannot possibly fathom. We can detect here what is commonly referred to as survivor's guilt as well. To be tormented by the mere fact that you survived when others did not. To conjure up scenarios where the right thing happened or where the right person died. This is a fact of life for many people who survive traumatic events. I think that Auerbach recognizes that applying a moral dilemma to the idea of cause and effect is unhelpful and self destructive to people. Our narrator should not be blaming himself for the fact that he was caught in these events, what seems to be almost a kind of fate that he couldn't control. This portrayal is very effective to me because it doesn't downplay the severity of the guilt felt by the survivors of terrible accidents. At the end of the story, our narrator is probably in a far worse mental state than he was at the beginning. He wishes that he could have stayed in blissful ignorance, but the preservation of his ignorance, it turns out, was incredibly harmful to him. However, he still can't shake the feeling that he wishes he had never learned all of these things. It doesn't bring him an ounce of closure. And that's one of the things that is so effective and so really heart wrenching about this story. There is no closure. Does our narrator learn more about his friend? Can he perhaps feel some solace that his friend did not abandon him? No, not really. There's nothing good or comforting about what the narrator has learned. And yet we have to ask ourselves, was it the right thing to hide it from him? Here we must talk about the theme of regret. Our narrator expresses profound regret, even for things that he cannot directly control. He laments that Josh ever found him during that first week of kindergarten. Our narrator also reflects, only passingly, on his failure to give Josh a hug on the last day they met, saying, I thought about giving Josh a hug, but realized that might be embarrassing for both of us, so I just gave him a low five. That was the last time I saw my friend, and a couple of months later, he was gone. These small moments of detail show just how well Auerbach is incorporating these themes into his story. This is a real emotional gut punch for the reader, as we realize that this is the last time the narrator will ever see Josh, and this prevents any kind of closure. At the very end of the story, this detail is confirmed as the narrator says, I think about Josh. I loved him then. I love him even still. I miss him more now that I know I'll never see him again, and I find myself wishing that I had hugged him the last time I saw him. Once again, there's a complete denial of closure in this story. There is no justice and there are no warm feelings left. Only when speaking with his mother many years later will our narrator learn that Josh held on to their map until the very end. that he never gave up on trying to complete the map, that he might have been kidnapped while trying to complete the map. The fact that his friendship never died will bring the narrator no solace, only more guilt and regret, knowing that Josh, intentionally or not, died for him or in place of him. Another character who feels profound regret in this story is the narrator's mother. The attempt to finally reveal the truth to her son, it turns out, will do irreparable damage to her psyche. The failure to speak frankly and be honest will cost her dearly in the coming years. The narrator tells us this: I imagine that we will spend the rest of our lives repairing what took a lifetime to build. I think that the walls meant to insulate me from harm were also protecting her emotional stability. As the truth came pouring out the last time we spoke, I could hear a trembling in her voice that I think was a reverberation of the collapse of her world. These walls that the mother had erected are ultimately a tool of deceit. Her goal was to keep her son safe from the evils of the world. Imagine a young Buddha kept within the palace walls. The end results of her efforts are this: leaving her son and his friend totally unprepared for the danger that beset them. For her efforts, she is forced to relive the terror all over again. A message is being delivered here that parents can be completely misguided in the protection of their children. We see how the mother ultimately failed to protect her child from anything. While some of her policies no doubt saved her son from greater danger, her hiding of the truth from him ultimately made matters far worse. These regrets are made obvious in the final chapter. She could not bring herself to tell him what she had kept from everyone all these years. Not that that information would do any good now, anyway. Josh's family never knew about the night I had woken up in the woods. They never knew about the Polaroids. They never knew about the note she found on my pillow. They never knew the real reason we had moved out of our old home in such haste. She knew now that she should have talked to Josh's parents, but there was nothing to say anymore. What was our narrator's mother's key mistake? She attempted to protect normalcy, attempted to cover up the truth of their hard life. She had successfully hidden poverty from her child. Why not these events, too? The story is calling on us as the reader to speak frankly and tell the truth in our own lives, lest we lose the chance to do so. Finally, I must talk about the antagonist of this story, the large, kind of hulking, but seemingly ordinary man at the center of this plot. The crazed stalker of Penpal is one of the most memorable and effective antagonists that I have seen in a horror story. This feat is remarkable, given what little page time this character has. But then again, the rule of show, don't tell is in full display here. We can count the words attributed to this character on probably one hand. We have a few instances of I love you, one hello in the woods, and a few other lines when impersonating Veronica. We can't be sure if he's the man that appears at the snow cone stand talking to the boys for some time, but I'm personally guessing that he is not. The time frame doesn't really add up with this man showing up and them receiving the stamped note. He's a man of very little dialogue. We know that he's perfectly capable of speech as he talks with Josh's father easily enough, and characters remark on his normality. For example, the narrator's mother. When she pictured him, whether in waking life or a dream, he was always evil and always terrifying. But as she stared at his face, she thought that this didn't look like who she imagined at all. This was just a man. We know that the stalker was a deranged and disgusting sexual predator, as awful as they come. We know that his campaign of harassment included the deaths of everyone the narrator got close to, who the killer could get his hands on. Mrs. Maggie, Veronica, boxes, anyone or anything that dared to vie for him for the narrator's affection was killed, and brutally at that. All this we can gather from the stalker's actions, not from words. The stalker never explains himself, and we never get a full explanation. Hell, his identity is left a mystery, as the police never catch him and never discover his body. There are many theories as to who the stalker is. The main character's absent father, A police officer, perhaps the same one that visits the narrator's house, or an orderly at the hospital, which I believe to be the most likely answer if it's not a police officer. Because we have to remember that he was able to get Veronica's phone, which means he needs to have been able to access probably the hospital room that she was in. So, hospital worker or police officer make a lot of sense. It hardly matters, however, as the stalker in the end is not meant to be seen as an individual whose goals are justified. He is, as the text says, just a man. Furthermore, he is man. He is a symbol of the evil side of the human race. As our narrator says, the world is a cruel place made crueler still by man. We see in the killer a twisted perversion of love, the love shared between the narrator and his friends. His actions reflect not only a romantic and lustful obsession with our protagonist, but also an attempt to supplant all others. We'll recall that although he did not target the mother directly, he did show some aggression towards her by stabbing that nail into her tire, presumably. So he seems to have really disliked just about everyone who was close to the narrator. He needed to kill Maggie, presumably for being too friendly with the boy, or else in a fit of rage at her spoiling a plan of his. He must kill Boxes, too, for being too beloved by the boy. And of course, he needed to kill Veronica, as in his twisted mind, she's a rival in love. The stalker likely held out hope that by some miracle the narrator would come to acknowledge him and love him in return. That night in the theater, most of all, I think, was the killer's twisted attempt at getting the narrator's attention. What then led the stalker to kill himself? We may never know, but in my mind, I think that two things are likely. One, that the narrator failing to notice him as anything other than a weird man at the movie theater made the stalker realize his plan would never work. For all of his acts of evil, I think the antagonist of Penpal is ultimately a coward. Having stalked and pursued children, he cannot even bring himself to talk to the object of his twisted affections. The simple act of ignoring him has the effect of driving him to suicide. Another possibility. With Veronica only recently deceased and a police investigation underway, it is likely that the killer's days are numbered. Although he evaded the police after Mrs. Maggie's murder and the kidnappings, the stalker will not be able to evade them forever, especially since the narrator was able to give a detailed description of his vehicle. Having killed Veronica in a fit of rage, the stalker now realizes that he will be caught any day now. He has no time to act out his true final plan, presumably abducting the narrator, and instead kills himself and Josh as a substitute for the narrator. I believe it is possible that, after kidnapping Josh and locking him away, the killer still planned to abduct the narrator at some point. His killing of Veronica meant that he no longer had the time to look for this opportunity. In other words, he ruined things for himself. Per usual with horror tales, I think no matter how effective they are, oftentimes the scenarios that we make for horror stories are a little bit convoluted and sometimes stretch the power of logic and reasoning. Penpal, I think, is more tightly written than a lot of other horror stories, but it still requires quite a few leaps of logic in order to buy into the story fully. Example I would give is the death of Mrs. Maggie in this story. It really does a number on the credibility if you let yourself think about it for a while. I don't really have a problem with the murder itself occurring. It's clear from context that Mrs. Maggie was being used by the murderer, and he hoped that one day Maggie might be able to get the narrator into her house. When Maggie instead inadvertently warned the narrator to stay away from Tom, the killer flew into a rage and killed her, chopping her into pieces. This all happens when the narrator is still a very young boy, and here is where my problems begin. Because the narrator mentions that just a few weeks later, garbage bags were being taken out of Mrs. Maggie's house. How did our protagonist not ever hear about Mrs. Maggie's murder and put two and two together that he had been stalked by a murderer that night. Realistically speaking, at this point, there would probably be plenty of forensic evidence for the police to go off of as well to catch this murderer. Again, there's a possibility that the murderer is a police officer, but it just seems like the way Mrs. Maggie's death went in the story, the way her body was relatively quickly discovered, really meant that there wasn't a good reason for the killer to evade capture for so long. Of course, it's possible that it could happen here, but it's very strange that the narrator doesn't really know much about this, right? And this is a problem that we see with a few different parts of this story. The narrator should clearly be aware of events through the news, through media, through talking to his peers that he just seems to not be aware of at all. Mainly because we don't address the fact that the narrator is in school this whole time and therefore should be talking to classmates about this kinds of stuff. So we have some more logical issues here. We know that the narrator's mother was aware of the kidnapping attempt and notified the police about it. It's believable that the police would be unable to find the stalker based on this evidence, although it's much less believable that the narrator's mother purposefully hid this information from Josh's family. She has zero convincing reasons, in my opinion, to not tell Josh family. Supposedly, it's to keep his life normal, but no normal person would do this, in my opinion. And regardless, even if the mother never told anybody about this, it wouldn't really matter because the police would probably have issued a bulletin on this, right? You have a child who was probably abducted. There was a fake letter left on his bed. This is something that the police would have addressed. They would have told the public about this to guard their children. Instead, literally nothing comes of it. Again, this is a common problem that most horror stories have, especially with an antagonist that's something realistic, like a serial killer or an obsessed stalker. You need to somehow neuter the police force to make them less effective than they are in real life when dealing with these kinds of cases. There's another issue with the plot that I actually think is a minor one, if it's important at all, but I will address it here. A lot of people frequently raise the problem of the stalker turning his attention to Josh instead of going after the narrator. We know that the stalker was not living close to the narrator's new home, but he definitely seems to know where the narrator lives. Until he becomes 14 or 15 years old, we know that the narrator evades the stalker almost entirely, except for getting an anonymous love letter at the age of 12, which again, of course, implies that the stalker knows where he lives. How else would this gift have made it into the mail? Later on in the story, when he's about 15 years old, the stalker never once makes an attempt to capture him. I understand that upon taking the picture of Josh, he may have decided to target Josh instead, but he's still clearly obsessed with the narrator. Why does he settle? What made Josh the easier target of the two? Why was the boy with two parents an easier target than the poor boy with only his one mother to defend him? I actually believe the idea that Josh was taken for the sake of convenience. We know that Josh was looking around in the woods to finish the map, and he was probably abducted then. The problem I have with this is that Josh reports sleepwalking. We know that this is a sign that he has been getting abducted while sleeping by the same stalker. So the problem here becomes the stalker is able to enter Josh's home more or less at will and take him away. I simply don't believe this could ever be the case, especially when Josh is already 12 years old. It just doesn't make sense to me that he was consistently breaking into the house and abducting this kid, and then perhaps abducting him at a later date as well, more permanently. Finally, there's a little quibble regarding the writing of the narrator and Josh at the time that they are young boys. For most of the book, the boys are between the ages of 5 and 7. Somehow they are able to hand draw a map navigate the woods by themselves, and build a raft. Uh, as someone who's worked kind of extensively with kids of this age, I can safely say that most of them cannot tie their shoes. Most of them cannot write properly, let alone do things like this. It definitely felt at times that Auerbach was writing older protagonists. Maybe not quite adults, but it definitely felt like his 5 year olds were older boys, perhaps between, again, 8 and 10 years old, and that his 10-year-olds were much closer to teenagers in the way that they behaved and spoke. So, in the end, I have to say that this story can be a little bit of a logical mess at times without even taking into account the improbability of the inciting incident, the balloon Penpal experiment, which no self respecting or sane teacher would think is a good idea. Again, I have to say this is a slight criticism. In order to make good horror stories, we do sometimes have to stretch the bounds of believability. And because the story is so effective, I don't really blame it too much, especially because this story ends up being so effective that you really don't think about the logical problems. All right, time to wrap things up. Upon my first reading of this book, I was completely gripped by it. I thought that it was essentially the perfect horror story. It is an effective, perfectly paced narrative with wonderful build up to all of its important scary moments. It is a truly horrifying and at sometimes disgusting book, but not because of any kind of gore or gross out factor. It's just because its antagonist is that deplorable. I'm still very impressed by this book, even after reading it several times, and I continue to admire it. Even better than just being a horror story, I feel that Pen Pal had a real moral core to it that the best horror stories have. It has something to say about the human condition and the way that our minds work. It deals with themes of truth, memory, regret, and even brotherly love in a way that I did not expect and did not fully appreciate at first. As we stand here, a whole 13 years, I believe it is, past the original publication of this landmark book, I can still wholeheartedly recommend it to just about everybody.